So, what's the situation in Syria today? Well, to say the least, it's complicated. So, Syria has been through a civil war for 5 years now. It started with protests against the Bashar al Assad regime during the wave of protests carrying through the North Africa, Middle East region during what's known as the Arab Spring. In Syria, that protest led to crackdowns by the government, instances of imprisonment, torture, violent counterattacks led to protesters arming themselves and striking back, which led to a whole dynamic between the government and rebels, which has then devolved into a civil war. Much has happened over those 5 years, which has brought in other countries in intervention. But as of today, in 2016, 5 years into the civil war, the government held territory in Syria looks something like this. The Bashar al Assad regime holds many pockets throughout western Syria, which is the most populated portions of Syria. Although they have lost control of much of their country, um, they have steadily fought against rebel groups to try to take back territory. Those rebel groups today hold pockets as well in western Syria, in areas around Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus, the capital city. Another dynamic of this civil war is that of the Islamic State, originating out of Iraq in what was called Al Qaeda of Iraq. Um, Quickly after the country of Syria reached instability, Al Qaeda of Iraq entered the country to take territory. They have since declared themselves the Islamic State, trying to establish a caliphate in Syria and Iraq. They quickly took over a lot of territory. In Syria today, they hold this amount of territory, which seems drastic. They were successful in taking a lot of territory. Some of that territory has dwindled in the last year or so. But they do hold a large swath of eastern Syria. However, this is less populated territory. It's a lot of desert, but they do hold important cities along the Euphrates River, including what has now been entitled the unofficial capital of ISIS, Al Raqqa or Raqqa. Um, Another dynamic is the Kurds in northeastern Syria. This is an ethnic group which is located in southern Turkey, in northern Iraq, and in northern Syria. They have been integral and been supported by the United States in taking back a lot of territory in northern Syria. And they have been the main ally of the United States forces. So, what else is going on in Syria today? Well, a lot. Let's take a step back and recap the United States foreign policy goals, because these are all kind of at play in Syria. Of course, national security. You have ISIS, potential threat to national security. You have trade, which is important because there is a lot of trade opportunities in the Middle East, especially centered around oil. You have spreading democracy. United States has come down against the Bashar al-Assad regime, mainly because of the anti-democratic rhetoric of that regime. You have humanitarian rights. A lot of people are suffering in Syria today, a lot of refugees, a lot of civilian deaths, a lot of horrors committed by the Bashar al-Assad regime against his own people. Stopping terrorism, of course, is important. This goes along with national security and the threat from ISIS. And then finally, world peace. Syria is probably the biggest conflict in the world today. And so the United States has a priority to try to mitigate that violence. Since 2014, a lot has developed. There's been a major bombing offensive by Syrian forces in support of or with support of the Russian forces in Aleppo. This is an image of Aleppo. You can just see the effects of that air campaign in that city. Here's another image of Aleppo. A lot of civilian casualties in this war due to air campaigns from the Syrian government, airstrikes from the Syrian government in rebel-held territories with Russian support. There's also been accusations of American-created civilian casualties in parts of Syria. But the rebel groups have been fighting on for years now, although they are steadily losing territory to Bashar Assad's government regime forces, along with that Russian support. As the United States is concerned, today in that region, we have moved in some 3,000 forces into Iraq and 300 troops into Syria. Now, these are quote unquote non-combative roles, meaning they are in support of Iraqi army forces or rebel forces allied with the United States. They are advisory roles. They are advising them, although there has been deaths already but amongst U.S. troops due to their proximity to these other forces fighting against either the Syrian regime or ISIS. There's been criticisms against the United States. One especially happened over the summer, July 19, 2016. The U.S. coalition is suspected of killing a number of civilians in a town occupied by ISIS during an airstrike. A lot of criticism, especially emphasized by the Russian government. Although there was some positive movement in late summer of 2016, Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart agreed to a ceasefire. They negotiated a ceasefire for months. The hope of the ceasefire in Syria was to deliver much-needed aid to areas that were heavily bombed over the summer, especially Aleppo. That ceasefire only lasted a week, and there was a lot of criticism from the U.S. government over Syria and Russia's inability to meet the criteria of that ceasefire. Soon after, the United States resumed its airstrikes, and another blunder, September 17th of 2016, the U.S. mistakenly bombs Syrian regime troops who were in combat with ISIS in a town or city in eastern Syria. Very concerning due to the fact that Russia is allied with Syria. We killed some Syrian troops. Would that heat up altercations between the Syrian regime, Russia, and the United States? Another area of provocation, a couple days later, a United Nations aid convoy was bombed in Aleppo. It was agreed and announced to the Syrian government that this aid convoy would deliver much-needed aid to areas in Aleppo heavily bombed. The hopes was to deliver that aid to civilians, yet this convoy was bombed. And the United States claims that Russia was the party responsible. And here's some after effects of that bombing. Finally, and probably the most recent development, there's evidence that Russia has moved in anti-missile defense systems into Syria. This is important because, well, no rebel groups, including the Islamic State, have any missiles or air power. So the conclusion there is that these are only meant for American forces, who are the only party amongst these players outside of Russia and Syria that have the air capabilities. So another provocation and another implication that this conflict is very complicated, very precarious, and very fragile.